Hello. Many of you will be familiar with the film Singing in the Rain with Gene Kelly, and a character much satirized by Jean Hagen, an excellent actress, who played Lena Lamont, the airhead star of the Lockwood and Lamont films. And she's got no brain at all, and they do what they can to stop her from showing her idiocy publicly. Well, it seems like Hollywood, having no sense at all, is not particularly bothered about somebody like Rachel Zegler showing how little grasp she has of life and how patronizing she is to her audience when she's talking about the new film Snow White. I have not seen the film, and that's why up to now I haven't said anything about it, but I have seen the interviews, and it's about those that I would like to talk. I don't quite know how the film goes, but apparently, according to Zegler, Snow White is now a strong woman who doesn't sit around waiting for her prince. In which case, my question is, why don't you just star in something else about a strong woman who doesn't wait for her prince to come? Why can't you find any Hollywood writers? I'm not talking about Zegler in particular, by the way. I'm talking about the entire Hollywood system. What's wrong with a fresh new story? Perhaps using Snow White as a springboard, but bringing it up to date and not parasitizing off the old story. You can still take the bones, can't you? Zegler says that the original film came out in 1937. It seems she doesn't know that the original story was written in the 19th century by the Brothers Grimm, but the original story came out in the 13th century. And instead of, as I say, coming up with that, why don't they just come up with a similar idea, but a modern, proper, original version of that story? Because, it's not possible. It's probably not possible to come up with a completely original story. People have been around for millions of years, and we've been telling stories about each other as long as we could tell stories. That's not the important thing. The important thing is to make it original for its time, and it doesn't look like that's what's happened to Snow White. So I'm going to be talking to you not about Snow White, but about Jane Eyre and the Cinderella story, just to show you how it can be done. Before I do that, I'll tell you I am Grannyopteryx. I'm on YouTube, Rumble, BitChute and Mind. I'm also on Twitter and Gab, where I let you know I've uploaded new videos. All the links to my other channels and to donation sites are in the description. But meanwhile, the best thing you can do for this video and for my channel is to like the video, to share it, to subscribe, and to remember to click the notification button. Right, let's carry on. Jane Eyre and Cinderella. We all know the story of Cinderella. Some of you might not be that familiar with Jane Eyre. Don't worry, I'll tell you the important points as they arise. Here we have an orphan girl who is set upon by her ugly siblings, in this case, Georgiana, Eliza, and John, the children of Mrs. Reed, Jane Eyre's not very sympathetic guardian. Jane endured hardship through her childhood until she found her prince, Edward Rochester, and is transformed into a beautiful woman in her fairy tale wedding dress. But just in the middle of the ball, when she's swept away by happiness, in this case at the altar in the church, the clock strikes And the clock is striking, in this case, in the person of Richard Mason, who is the brother of Bertha Mason. Who is Bertha Mason, you might ask? Well, she is Mr. Rochester's currently alive wife. She's still alive, but she's quite murderously mad and has been locked away in the attic of Thornfield Hall, which is where Rochester lives. And she's been a terrible secret kept in the care of a somewhat doubtful character called Grace Poole. So far, so close to the original. But now, this is where the story takes a modern turn. And remember, this story was written by a young woman in the middle of the 19th century, a time when we think of absolute morality and people, actually it's a bit of a myth, the story about wrapping the legs of furniture so the legs won't be exposed. No, they did wrap the legs of furniture to protect the wood from damage. Servants were not that careful when sweeping or hauling buckets around, but yeah, that's another story. But we like to think of the 19th century as being a sort of towering pillar of morality. So just remember that. The story was written in 1847 by a provincial vicar's daughter. Okay? Now, what happens when Jane suddenly discovered her intended husband is already married? Well, Rochester offers Jane a sort of marriage anyway. He says, you know, I'll look after you just as a wife. And there's no doubt that she does feel a strong physical attraction to him. And she solves the problem by running away. Now, not because of the immorality of being a mistress, but because she doesn't want to be a kept woman. Now, this is way ahead of her time, isn't it? The story, as I say, was published in 1847. And remember, it was at a time when women were legally minors for their entire life. To continue the story, remember how Cinderella runs out of the palace having lost all her finery and has to walk home barefoot. Well, basically, that's what happens to Jane Eyre. And finally, she returns to her old life, not quite as a scullery maid, but as a teacher in a very out-of-the-way Yorkshire village, until suddenly somebody comes round with a glass slipper. It turns out that she's an heiress, and this is where the fairy tale really does take a turn for the 19th century, or even the 20th. Jane Eyre, having inherited a very substantial fortune, and as she puts it, having become an independent woman, she goes back to Rochester with the intention of living with him, but on equal terms. It's only when she gets back to Thornfield Hall, she's a vicar's daughter after all, it's only when she gets back there that she discovers that she can actually marry him because his wife has died. And so there's the story of Cinderella, which is not called Cinderella, it's called Jane Eyre. And if you don't believe me that is actually a clever updating of Cinderella, then as final proof, I will point out to you that Bronte's description of Eyre's life as a married woman, well, it's a bit sparse, isn't it? And it's sort of vague because it isn't part of the story. Cinderella ends with the wedding. Anyway, the point I'm making is that Bronte didn't call it Cinderella. She didn't tout it as a remake showing a strong 19th century woman who doesn't sit among the ashes waiting for her prince to arrive. She just tells a story using the Cinderella idea as a springboard, but using it in the way she saw it originally, as an original idea in her century. A springboard that's so heavily disguised, I dare say not many people even realise that's what it is. And although I suppose some critics must have noticed the similarity, although I've done a lot of reading of literary criticism as an English graduate, I haven't seen any detailed analysis of the story along those lines. Although somebody must have described it as a Cinderella story somewhere along the line. Anyway, back to Snow White. I have an idea for Hollywood. Instead of taking the Mona Lisa and cutting it up to make an origami pig, why don't you just come up with an original Mona Lisa of your own? Just a thought. All right, till next time. Why not treat yourself or a favoured relative or friend to these magnificent examples of merch? The mugs and t-shirts come in the Graniopteryx design or Grambo with a firearm or the more deadly knitting needles. Go to www.graniopteryx.com and whatever platform you're watching this on, please click like, subscribe and share.